So we're on the Torah portion, Pinchas, this week. And like I said last week, I had intended for this to be a two-part, not a series, just a two-part lesson, because so much of what occurred in Balak bleeds over into Pinchas. And hopefully what we'll do today is tie the two together and really see them as one unfolding story. And so for your Torah memory book, if you're keeping note cards with little summaries of what's in each Torah portion, what I came up with for the Torah portion, Pinchas, was after Bilaam teaches the Midianite women to seduce the Israelite men, Pinchas kills Zimri and Cosbi and stops the plague. I know there's way more than that in the Torah portion, but that was just my attempt at a summary that would keep the continuity, because we're almost, again, at the end of Bamidbar. We've almost concluded another book. And so we've almost finished our memory book on that book of the Torah. And having these little summaries really do help us see that particular book as its own story, as well as how it ties into the whole story of the Torah. The things you learn through story, by the way, are probably the things that you'll remember the longest. And that includes music. Music tells a story. And a lot of times, I was driving down the road this morning and thinking about the lesson from last night. I was still teaching it to myself, which is usually what happens when I teach a lesson. I've taught it to myself first. But we were talking about the roots last night and what it takes to put down firm roots so that you're not easily moved by tribulation. And it reminded me of a song I learned when I was a little kid. And it had to do with, I shall not, how'd it go? I shall not be moved. I shall not be moved, just like a tree that's planted by the water. No, I shall not be moved. Now that's all I remember of the song, but that tells the story. And for that particular time in my life, I was very young, but things were very transient in my life. And telling myself the story of a tree that wouldn't be moved, that was such an encouragement. And so even the stories of the Torah are prophecy and encouragement to us. So these stories we're reading about Pinchas and Bilaam and Balak and so forth is prophecy, definitely. But these are stories to embed in our spirit so that we can call them up at times where we need encouragement. To know that even when it feels like we've been cursed somehow, like somebody cursed us and we weren't aware of it, it doesn't matter. That person cannot curse what Adonai has blessed. The only way for us to engage in a curse is to choose it, which is going to be the pattern we'll see today with Israel. Bilaam was unable to curse them until they stepped into rebellion. And so you ask yourself the question, do I see any area of my life where I'm in open rebellion? If not, then I'm not going to be moved. It's just an opportunity for me to put down my roots deeper, even though it looks like nothing's happening above. So our tip of the week is kind of along the same line as we had last week, because it's truly one story here. And our tip is that those who act in the realm of death will often borrow from or imitate the realm of life in order to deceive. And this is going to be a vital component of sorcery or magic. In other cases, all you need to do is flip the words. You can flip the words around and you can find the witches or the wizards or the sorcerers' true intent. You can find out what their motivation truly is, or what the object of those words truly is. So sometimes it will run a track so close, it's hard to tell life from death. At other times, they'll just flip it the entire way. And we might attribute this particular thing because it's so apparent when it happens, when they just completely flip the script. That's often a way we can look to heaven and say, thank you, Father, you just revealed that person to me. And sometimes it'll come off like, if there's a person who's a habitual liar or deceiver, many times they will go around accusing the innocent of what they actually did. You're like, how weird is that? Because, if I had done that, the last thing I would want to do is draw attention to the act. But instead, it's like they're somehow compelled to still pin it on somebody, not themselves, but pin it on somebody. And you're like, that is totally weird. If I really wanted to, move attention away, I wouldn't bring that subject up. But again, when you start twisting things, a lot of times the person doing the twisting, like we saw last night, they're in a realm of confusion. And so their words are confused. And they're the only ones who don't know it. So a Torah portion is Pinchas, which means a mouth of bronze. This is exactly what Pinchas has in the situation. He knows exactly what to do. He knows exactly what to say. And he acts at a moment when Moses and Aaron are reduced to just sitting around crying at the doorway of the tent of meeting. Like I said last night, don't beat yourself up if you're going through a stage where you feel like you're confused and you're a little cry-fied, you're a little whiny. It's a stage. It's an opportunity to put down some deep roots. Even though it feels like, nobody loves me, everybody hates me, I'm going to eat some worms. It's a stage. It shouldn't be a state. I've run into people where it's become a state. They're in a whiny, gripey, complaining, cry-fied state. That's different. Somehow they didn't pull out. It wasn't a stage of growth. It just became a place to camp out and feel sorry for themselves. And so that's why he sends people like Pinchas into our lives. So when we're tempted to be like Moses and Aaron and just sit down and cry, like, I've done, after all we've done with these people, how can they possibly go into this rebellion? How can they possibly act with such immorality? How can they have anything to do with idols? I get their cry-fied state at this point. It's like, dude, I see why you're whining. I would be whining too. I'd just be walking off into the wilderness and never to be seen again, probably. Just, it's not worth it. I can't do it. But that's when you look for a Pinchas, when you feel like, I don't know if it's even worth it. I'm not making a difference here. Look for a Pinchas. The Father will send a Pinchas into your life. And your Pinchas will encourage you. Your Pinchas will give you good counsel. Your Pinchas may even act on your behalf. Your Pinchas might pick up a phone and make a phone call on your behalf. Your Pinchas might initiate a reconciliation on your behalf. A Pinchas might send you a gift basket with chocolate. Somebody who can encourage you to just, I know you're whiny and cry-fied right now. It's a stage. But the word is firm, the word is established, the word is true. And now we must act. Please send us more Pinchases in our lives, especially as we enter through these troubled times. So we're told in scripture that rebellion is like the sin of witchcraft. It doesn't say it is witchcraft. If that were true, we'd all be witches. But it's like the sin of witchcraft. We've all rebelled at some point in our lives. Witchcraft is a method of circumventing the divinely appointed method. In other words, we were created in a certain way. We were given the operating manual called the Torah, and the operating manual tells us how we're supposed to function and what we're not supposed to do. And so rebellion or witchcraft is a way of doing the things we've been told not to do, or not doing things we have been told to do. There's a divinely appointed method for every aspect of our lives. And if we say we're going to circumvent that, then we fall into rebellion. Witchcraft is an extreme form of that. It's not only circumventing the divine will, it's tapping into deathly forces. I hate to even call them wicked because they're serving a function. The Holy One made them. So for him, they're serving a purpose. They're just not for us. They're not our business. That's the instruction. But we say, you know what, there's power there too. Let's tap into that. And he says, no, if you do that, you're touching the realm of death because I didn't make you to tap into those things. That's why you have to be so careful about things like deliverance ministry. You're tapping into things you don't really understand. And if you're tapping into them, living a life of impurity, remember, Leviticus is about go consult the priest, because this is a person who's going to live the most pure, ritually pure life. This is the person who understands clean and unclean. This is the person you want dealing with leprosy. This is the person you want dealing with states of tameh or uncleanness. It's not somebody who did research online. Clear difference here. And the Father, he's gracious to us, and I think he overlooks a lot. And you know, if a child calls his name, then I think he'll respond to that child. But we have to be really careful, because sometimes we just don't know what we're dealing with when we tap into that realm that he says don't. You know, don't have a conversation with it. If you do have to deal with an unclean spirit, then do just exactly what Scripture says, no more, no less, so that you don't leave yourself open. But that's what we see in this unholy alliance of Bilaam and Balak. We know that Balak had insight. He had tapped into a realm that would reveal to him specific places or times, rituals and ritual objects. These are part of sorcery. And what I wanted you to see is they're also part of a holy life. They were also part of the Mishkan, the holy service. And so there's an imitation here. So with Balak, he knows specific places, he knows specific times, he knows how to conduct rituals and how to use ritual objects. Because remember, he sent charms with the princes to Bilaam when he was trying to hire him. What Bilaam has is the ability to tap into words, which in this case is cursing words. They're death words. They're the opposite of what a priest would be using. He would be using the holy word. He would be using holy times. He would be using the appointed places and times. He would be using holy rituals and ritual objects. But there is a counterpart. And the difference is the sorcerer is going to rely on unclean or tameh forces, whereas holiness is going to rely on tahor or tahara, pure forces. And the easiest way to think of it is one deals with forces not permitted to human beings. That's sorcery. The other deals with forces or things that are permitted or commanded to human beings. It's that simple and that complex. So as we're reading the blessings uttered by Bilaam, they're going to have a connection even with our Torah portion this week with Pinchas. But each blessing that he utters is actually hinting to the curse that he would rather impose, because remember, he gets paid if he can impose these curses. And that's the phenomenon of a liar. They have a hard time completely shutting off the issue. If they've lied, they'll have to pin that lie on someone else. And so what actually happens here is Elohim twists Bilaam's tongue, so he has to speak the blessing. So what's happening here is every time Bilaam opens his mouth to speak a curse, his tongue gets twisted. And through divine intervention, he applies the opposite of the unclean words that he was about to apply to his target, which is the Israelites. So for every blessing that he utters upon the Israelites, we can go in there and we can determine pretty much what he intended for the curse to be. So with a person like this, who knows how to manipulate the words, they're going to be curses, they're going to be lies. And so the Holy One confuses his language, he confuses his tongue, and just turns it the other way. And now he's speaking the truth. And that's why I say sometimes with a person like this, just take the opposite of what they're saying and you'll have the truth. But there's an incident in the book of Acts of this. It's a prime example of this. And it bears out everything we said about Bilaam last week, how he loved the wages of wickedness. And let's just look at it. It's in Acts 16 through 18. And, the apostles are going around preaching the gospel. And it says, it happened that as we were going to the place of prayer, a slave woman who had a spirit of divination met us, who was bringing great profit to her masters by fortune telling. Well, right there, that's the sin of Bilaam. He loved the wages of wickedness. And so she's a slave woman, and in a sense, she's in survival mode, but her masters, they're making a fortune from her fortune telling. And so she starts following Paul. It says she followed Paul and us and cried out repeatedly, saying, "These men are bondservants of the Most High God, who are proclaiming to you a way of salvation." Now she continued doing this for many days. Well, right there, it sounds like she's saying the right thing, but match that to what Bilaam did. We know that's not what he wanted to say, but that's what he was forced to say when his tongue was twisted. He was forced to tell the truth. And now we've got a fortune-telling woman, and she's bringing profit by fortune-telling. Now, what she's saying would have cut off the money flow to a great extent to the masters who were profiting from her fortune-telling, because her fortune-telling is an explicit deviation from the Torah. And if people start listening to Paul and the apostles, like she's telling them to do, and saying they're proclaiming to you a way of salvation, and once you start walking in that way of salvation, there's no way you're going to listen to a fortune teller. And she did this for days. And that couldn't have been good for the ones profiting from what she was saying. It says, but Paul was greatly annoyed, and he turned and said to the spirit, "I command you in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach to come out of her." And it came out that very moment. And so Paul recognizes what is happening. Her tongue is being turned. But he wants this woman who is a slave, he wants her to be delivered. Now that couldn't have gone over well, again, with the masters, because it cuts off the cash flow. But we can see an example here of a different outcome than from Bilaam. We know that later in the story, Bilaam is going to be put to the sword. He will pay for what he's done. This woman is delivered from fortune telling, which is, Baruch Hashem, thank you, Yeshua. Thank you for the name of Yeshua, that instead of taking her to destruction with her practice of death, now he has brought her out into the light. He's brought her into life. And so, like we said last week, Bilaam and Balak, it's believed they were both sorcerers. Balak was thought to be the greatest magician in Moab. He had that special ability to know places and times, rituals, ritual objects. They think he was called Ben Sipur because he knew how to use this type of magic based on a bird that was built of the metals that match up to the four kingdoms of the beast. with the gold, the silver, and the copper. And of course, through their magic, it would appear that the bird would come alive and begin talking, just like we see in the book of Revelation. That's the problem, though. With sorcery, they're getting an incomplete picture. That's going to be another way it deceives, not just through the words, but through giving you the appearance that it's alive. That's what I say, with a fortune teller, you'll get fragments of truth, but you'll never get the whole truth. In fact, there will, in many cases, I think, be an irony, because it'll be the truth, but not the way that you perceived it. It'll be a kind of a cruel joke. But again, it'll give you the impression that it's tapping into a realm of life, when actually that's coming out of a realm of death. So the question is, why would an accomplished sorcerer like Balak need Bilaam to aid him? Well, remember, Balak knows times, he knows places, he knows rituals, and he knows ritual objects. But Bilaam is the word expert. He's an expert curser. And so together, Balak could choose the sacrificial sites and the sacrifices and the rituals, and then Bilaam would download. He would download the words. And we see that again in the book of Revelation. You have a false prophet who's going to work in tandem with the beast and the serpent. And in Revelation, the serpent, who has authority over the nations, is still trying to destroy the woman Israel with a flood of wickedness. Remember what we said last year about the serpent's area of operation is the water. Out of the water, he gives his authority to the beast, because the beast is land-based. But trying to destroy the woman Israel with the flood, you can add in there, if you know something about biblical symbolism, a flood of wickedness. He's just trying to swallow her up, which it feels like we're trying to be swallowed right now. There's just so much wickedness around. We're like, oh, Yeshua, help us. So within the text of Bilaam's blessings, the reason I wanted to bring out why Balak's particular form of magic matched the metals of the beast kingdoms is because Bilaam is also going to prophesy against the nations. And we can find this within the text itself. So we've got Pinchas, and Pinchas had to kill both an Israelite and a Midianite in order to stop the plague against Israel. And see, that's the problem. When you're in covenant, obedience, blessing is on the obedience side of the word. Should you step over into the disobedience or the rebellious side of the word, then it will bring out one of four altered judgments, or a combination of. We see in the book of Revelation, they're overlapping. They all go out. And they manifest themselves in different ways. But you can trace these plagues, even the 10 plagues of Egypt. You can trace them back to the four altered judgments. You can trace them back to the sword, the famine, the wild beast, and the plague. In this particular instance, when the young men began committing immorality with the Midianite women, eating things offered to idols, then it starts a plague. So eventually the apostate Israelites and the teaching nations of immorality, that was the thing we saw about Bilaam last week. He taught the Midianites. He taught the Moabites immorality. He wasn't happy with just, trying to do a job for hire and do the cursing. He says, well, if the curses won't work, I can show you how to make them walk into the curse. They're protected right now in the clouds of glory. Let me show you how to get rid of those protections. And so these teaching nations of immorality and apostate Israelites, they have to be eliminated in order to restore blessing to the earth. we've got the small story here of restoring blessing to the camp of Israel, but because of the nature of the blessings that Bilaam is saying against the nations, we see the prophecy in them. And we'll go through here and we'll give some examples. We won't have time to unpack the entire speech. But of course, we're in chapter 24 and verse 5. That's one of the most beautiful verses of scripture, still used in liturgy in the synagogue. How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. So you can see there's a blessing. He's pronouncing a blessing upon Jacob, upon the tribes. But look what he follows with. He says, his king shall be exalted over Agag. And remember, Agag is Amalek. He will consume the nations that oppress him. In other words, for the blessing to rest on the tents of Jacob, the prophecy is that Amalek will be destroyed, and the teaching nations of immorality will also be destroyed. It says he will consume them. Next, we'll back up a little bit. Chapter 23, verse 21. It says, I perceive no iniquity in Jacob. I perceive no sin in Jacob. That particular blessing concludes with the teruah of the king, the shout of the king. And remember, a teruah is one of the shofar calls. The shofar of the king is in him. And that's explained in the Midrash Rabbah to this particular verse. It says, these are the sounds of the shofar that he's talking about. And he's saying, this is the shofar of the king with which the wall of Jericho was miraculously destroyed. And then there's another verse. He reminds them, it is God who brought them out of Egypt, destroyed Pharaoh's army. So he destroys the army of Jericho. He destroys the army of Pharaoh. For the blessing to apply, he perceives no iniquity in Jacob. He's also prophesying the shout of the king, which remember they said was with Yahushua, which is the long form of Yeshua. Once this blessing completely rests upon Israel, it will be accompanied by the destruction of the wall of Jericho, which would have impeded the Israelites crossing back over into the land of Israel. And at that higher level, we've been looking about what does the land of Israel represent? It represents a return to the Garden of Eden. So the ancient wall of Jericho impeded the Israelites from crossing the Jordan and inheriting their land. In the future, Yeshua, the sound of the shofar will be in him, just like it says, as Paul's writing to the Thessalonians. When Yeshua sounds the shofar, the wall that prevents Israel from crossing over the Jordan and making Aliyah, going up into that level of the garden that hovers right over the physical land of Israel. That's how that works. At the same time, there's a blessing upon Israel. The curse is going to fall upon any impediment, whether it's people who are trying to keep Israel out of Israel, keeping Israel out of Israel. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Or whether it's those like Pharaoh's army who want to keep them locked into slavery, just like we read about the slave woman who was following Paul and the apostles around, and she was freed. So at the same time that she receives a blessing of freedom, it also destroys the power of sorcery that has been residing in her. And this we looked at last week, Numbers 23:21. It says, he has not looked at misfortune in Jacob nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord his God is with him, and the joyful shout of a king is among them. Right? So remember, when pointing out idolatry in the tribe of Dan didn't work at the first location of the sacrifices, they take it to a second location and start the rituals over again. And that's where Bilaam and Balak attack the extreme end. They see a weakness in the death of Moses, that somehow there would be a vacuum of leadership. Well, what they didn't see, without that supernatural, remember Bilaam says, one having his eyes uncovered, he couldn't have seen it unless the Holy One allowed him to see it. At this point, he's like, it's useless to curse him, because Moses in this Torah portion is going to ordain Yahushua. And Yahushua is going to lead the Israelites over the Jordan. And this particular sacrifice takes place inside of Mount Nebo, at Pisgah. So they can see Jericho, they can see the Jordan River, they can see Mount Nebo where Moses died. What do we see here? Even though Moses is going to die, that's not going to be a weak spot for the Israelites, because that's where Yahushua is going to step up as a man of war, and he will lead the people over the Jordan. The shout of the king, the teruah, the shofar of Yeshua will sound, that will destroy the walls that are preventing a return to the land of Israel, and that elevation to the land as we were intended to experience it. It takes away the obstruction. And so this particular thing, I mean, what is it? The blessing. Well, no misfortune in Jacob, no trouble in Israel. I know we're not quite there yet, but when we hear the joyful shout of the king who is already among us, just like Yahushua, he had been among the people for all these years. And I'm sure the people were aware of him, but as long as Moses was alive, they didn't pay that much attention to him. But now they know Moses is dead, they're going to listen to Yahushua, and he's going to lead them over. And so for this blessing to take effect, it's going to mean the destruction of Jericho. I hope you see this pattern here. When the blessing fully rests on Israel, one of the immoral nations is going to be destroyed, or more. It might be more than one. Then he says, there is no divination in Jacob. That's chapter 23, verse 23. So that had to have felt a little funny. We've got a sorcerer who's speaking this blessing over Jacob. There's no divination in Jacob. Like Bilaam's a diviner, but he says there's no sorcerers in Jacob. So what has to happen for sorcery and divination to be completely removed from Israel? Well, the curse is going to fall upon other people. He says, behold, the people will arise, Israel will arise like a lion cub and raise itself like a lion. It will not lie down until it consumes its prey and drinks the blood of the slain. Right? So he's saying, in order for sorcery to be removed in Jacob, then Israel will have to arise as warriors, and they will have to destroy their prey. Those who preyed upon them will become the prey of Israel. And so those nations that tried to teach them immorality, those nations that tried to teach them sorcery, they will have to fall upon them and destroy them in order to remove the divination from their own camp. In 23:10, we have the question, who has counted the dust of Jacob? Well, if we look at the verse that precedes it, he says, behold, It is a nation that will dwell in solitude and not be reckoned among the nations. Right? This makes you think of when the Jews were in Persia, when the scroll of Esther was written, and the complaint that wicked Haman had to the king, may his name be blotted out, was that there is a people who dwell among you, that they keep their own laws, they serve their own God. I mean, they're living right here among the 127 provinces of your empire, and it's like they're a nation within a nation. They're separated. They dwell in solitude. They have not assimilated to your cultural program. They've not assimilated to your social reality. They still dwell in solitude. And so whatever it is that identifies this nation, and in, of course, the scroll of Esther, what identified them is they have their own laws, they have the Torah, and they serve their God. They don't serve all the pantheon of gods that we have. Instead, they serve this one. Instead, they submit to his laws. Well, in order for that proliferation, in order for that recognition of this nation that will rise up like the lion, they have to, number one, dwell in solitude. They have to maintain the Torah. They have to maintain their covenant. They can't assimilate to the ways of the nations. But at the very same time, there will be a reckoning among those nations within whom they dwelled. In other words, if these people were dwelling among you, there was a testimony among you, and you chose to rebel against it and to not pay attention to it. So there will be a reckoning upon those nations who have not turned to the light of the Holy One. It says in chapter 24, verse 17, a star has issued from Jacob, but it concludes with, and he shall pierce the nobles of Moab and undermine the children of Shet. All right, so what's he talking about here? Well, this is going to come about very quickly. One fulfillment of this prophecy will come about in Pinchas, from Torah portion Balak to Torah portion Pinchas. He will pierce the nobles of Moab. That's a preliminary glimpse. But in the time to come, when Messiah returns, when that star does issue from Jacob, then once again, the nobles of Moab and Midian, they're going to be pierced and undermined, which is exactly what they tried to do to Israel. So think of the instructions that we get in the Torah portion, Pinchas. Also, it'll come up in Matot. It's like there'll be an interruption here in Pinchas. We'll get this information. Okay, you're gonna have to take vengeance here upon the Midianites because they got involved with the Moabites. This was a quarrel the Moabites had. Bilaam had nothing to do with this quarrel. He invited himself. The Midianites had nothing to do with this quarrel. They invited themselves into the quarrel. And he says, okay, because they took up a quarrel that was not their own, and they tried to undermine my people, you're going to have to take vengeance upon them. And then it'll drop it for a while, and then it'll pick back up in the next Torah portion, Matot, where you'll get more specific instructions on how they're supposed to take vengeance upon the Midianites. And then remember, it was the nobles of Moab that Balak sent to Bilaam to request his curses. So he's kind of saying, okay, the whole group of you, Remember how he told Moses, Aaron, and Miriam when it came to the Cushite woman, he says, come out here, you three. Well, this is kind of what's happening with Moab, Midian, and Bilaam. Come out here, you three, because you're all three going to be pierced and undermined. What you tried to do to my people is going to be done to you. So in the Torah portion, Pinchas takes up a spear and he pierces Zimri and Cosby. And the understanding from the sages is the place where he pierced them would have been in their reproductive organs, which corresponds to the lesson we had last night from Song of Songs about the root and the fruit. But in this particular case, we saw a star. We saw somebody who stood out, who maintained light when it felt very dark. And he took up a spear and he pierced the Moabite nobles and their recruit, Bilaam. Well, how exactly did that happen? Well, remember, Cosby was the daughter of a prince of Midian, right? They're seeing them as one group, Bilaam, Moab, Midian. Two of you people didn't have to be involved, but Bilaam, you were greedy, you wanted the wages. Midian, we're not sure what their involvement was because they hated the Moabites. But if you have an enemy, but then you develop a common enemy, a lot of times two enemies will join up just to take care of that other enemy. They had probably the least footing for being concerned, especially since Midianites lived among the Israelites. Remember Jethro, Yitro, his descendants joined themselves to the Israelites. So they really didn't have anything to fear. But some people, they just love a good argument. They just love a good quarrel. And maybe they thought they could profit from it. Who knows? Moses used to live among the Midianites. His wife was a Midianite. So really no point in their being involved in this. And so it was truly a shame that they selected a daughter. And the Torah even points this out. In chapter 24, verse 17, it says, it's because they sent a daughter of a prince of Midian, their sister, was slain over the matter of Peor. In other words, he's saying, what was so heinous about what the Midianites did is they sent the daughter of one of their nobles, and she had to be speared with Zimri, with the Israelite. So at the very same time this apostate Israelite is being judged, the nations are being judged as well. And he's saying there was no reason for this. But Bilaam had taught her immorality that ended up destroying her, which was the whole goal of Balak, the destroyer. And that's the way the destroyer works. That's the way sorcery works. Sorcery may have an object, whether it's a person or a business or whatever that it wants to destroy. But typically, because it's twisted, it'll end up destroying the wrong thing, and it'll end up destroying itself. So for the star to arise at the very same time, we see that these other nations, Moab and the children of Shit, the Midianites, they're going to have to be judged. It's part of this pattern that we're seeing. And this is why we can see that Bilaam keeps coming up in the New Testament. These are fundamental verses to understanding the judgment on the nations in the end times. These are the patterns that we need to look at. And so as long as it looks like Israel is under a curse, there may still be a little bit of time. But once the star arises, once the divination departs, once the assimilation stops and they begin to develop their identity as a nation among the nations, bound by their covenant, At that time, you know the nations are about to fall. Chapter 24, verse 19, it says, one from Jacob shall rule. Well, in order for one from Jacob to rule, at the same time, it says he will destroy the remnant of the city. Which city is it talking about? Well, let's look at some context in the book of Revelation. 16:19 says, the great city was split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations fell. Okay, the great city we know is Jerusalem. But as a result, the cities of the nations fell. Babylon the Great was remembered in the sight of God to give her the cup of the wine of his fierce wrath. So sometimes Jerusalem is called by the metaphor Babylon or Sodom. This tells you it's a judgment on the apostate among Israel. And as he judges the apostate among Israel, just like Zimri was pierced, but at the very same time, Cosby had to be pierced from the nations. So the apostate among Israel, they will be judged. And then it says at the same time here now, the cities of the nations will fall. The apostate nations, they'll have to fall. These things happen simultaneously. Revelation 17:18 says, the woman whom you saw is the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth. Right there again is Babylon. It's an economic system. It goes back to the harlot we were talking about in last night's lesson. The harlot, the difference between an adulteress and a harlot is typically that an adulteress is one who is bound in a covenant to her husband. And as we were talking about the seed of the word last night, she's receiving the seed of her husband, but yet as an adulteress, this person has also begun receiving the seed from other men. The harlot, on the other hand, is typically an unmarried woman. She's not walking in covenant. And so she's carrying the seed of many men. And remember, the seed is the word. And so we know that the harlot in the book of Revelation, it says she's committed harlotry with the kings of the earth. She's carrying the seed, the words of many kings. She's full of confusion, which again, Babylon, it goes to Bavel, confusion of the tongue. What does a sorcerer have? Well, if he has to tell the truth like Bilaam, his tongue is confused, because when he sets out to curse, he's not confused at all. That's what he chose to do. In this case, divine intervention twists his tongue into the truth. But typically what a sorcerer will do will twist the truth into an untruth. And so this great city specializes in turning truth into untruth. And that's how she reigns over the kings of the earth. She's not only a harlot, but there's sorcery involved. And you'll hear sorcery mentioned in the book of Revelation. And then Revelation 18:10, it says, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. So there's 2 types of city that are being destroyed. Apostate Jerusalem, those who they know the covenant, they know the word of God, they consider themselves joined to the Holy One, but yet they have been distracted and begun to commit adultery with other husbands. And then you have the harlots among the nation. They don't have a covenant relationship. And so they're filled with all kinds of seeds, mingled seeds, representing the nations, the kings of the earth. And so both of those have to fall. And when the apostates are destroyed and when the immoral nations are destroyed, when those cities are destroyed, then one from Jacob shall rule. In order for him to rule, he has to destroy the remnants of those cities that are apostate. And there will be people left in both cities. There will be the holy people left in the holy city, and there will be people out there among the nations of the earth that will also, there will be a remnant of them. But the rebellious, the sorcerers, those who refuse to agree to obey the Holy One, they have to be destroyed. And then the rule comes. And what we notice, if we kind of read through all those blessings that Bilaam speaks in one sitting, what we realize is that the content of those blessings, so many of them refer either directly or indirectly to Joshua's role. And remember, in Hebrew, he's Yahushua, which is the long form of Yeshua. Because if we go back in Joshua's history, he was the first one to defeat Amalek in Exodus 17:10. He was the one who dwelled with Moses in the tent in order to receive the instructions and to serve Moses. He accompanied Moses down Mount Sinai. He thought there was the sound of war in the camp. He led the army against Jericho. He led the wars against the Canaanites. He led the people over the Jordan and circumcised them again to be a nation set apart in covenant when they crossed into the land. And then in this Torah portion, Pinchas, we see Moses investing Yahushua with some of his spirit so that he can lead Israel in his place to go out and to come in. Moses says, I can't go out and come in anymore. What is he talking about? Remember, they're surrounded by the clouds of glory, or Sukkot of glory. And as long as they're in the clouds, in obedience, the enemy can't see them. And so that made it so hard. That's why Balak wanted Bilaam to come curse them. Like, curses, curses. We need to fight them, but we can't see them as long as they're dwelling in obedience. And so they can come out and make war on us, and we don't really see them coming. He says, the only way to fight these people is with words, because in the natural realm, we're not winning. Even the giants couldn't win. And so as Moses was also one who led the people out and brought them into the clouds of glory to show them what the garden would be like in that elevated state, supernatural food, supernatural water, supernatural clothes, supernatural shoes, his indwelling presence. He's saying, okay, I can't do this anymore, but Yahushua, you can do it. Yeshua, you can do it. And through destroying these nations that we hear all through Bilaam's blessings, the blessings on Israel are accompanied by the actual curse upon the nations. And this is going to bring a covenant of peace. It's going to bring peace to these remnants. And so when these kingdoms are slain, this is when we see Israel's tents fully restored into the garden, where they can cross over the Jordan. So here's an example, and you can do this on your own. It's just knowing that Bilaam's tongue is twisted. And if you put it back to his intent, you can find what he intended to curse them with. So he says in Numbers 23:9, behold, the people shall dwell in solitude. It shall not be reckoned among the Gentile nations. Well, this is thought to refer to Israel dwelling within the words of all the covenant. They're not going to be reckoned the same as the judgment on the nations. In fact, it says in Deuteronomy 32:8, the nations of the earth were reckoned according to the numbers of the sons of Israel, not the reverse. He says, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of mankind, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. So what did Bilaam want to do? He wanted to curse Israel to be dispersed among the nations, mixed among the nations, suffer judgment for sin, and at the same time to dilute the words of the Torah. Instead, he has to bless them. They will dwell in solitude. There will be a remnant who will go out into the nations. They will go out into the dispersion. And there will be a people who will not mix with the nations. They will repent of their sins, and they will not allow the words of the Torah to be diluted. So we could wonder if Bilaam couldn't curse what Adonai had blessed, then why did the curse activate? Last week we saw how the 42 lawless young men, the blasphemous young men, taunted Elisha, and they were destroyed by the 2 she-bears. And it fulfilled Joshua's curse on Jericho, cutting off the root and the fruit. And it matched the number of sacrifices that Balak brought in order to curse Israel. And so this is an example. This is what the Torah portion is teaching us. There's no outside force that can curse you. If you're walking in your covenant, if you're walking in faith with the Holy One, it has no effect. However, if you choose to depart from the glory of the cloud in disobedience, you've walked out into their territory where the curses do rule. Remember in the book of Daniel, 2 or 3 times the angel that comes to Daniel tells him, look, I would have been here sooner, but I had to fight with the prince of Persia. And then he says, and then the prince of Greece is going to come. What is he talking about? The Gentile nations have principalities and powers over them. And Bilaam and Balak somehow thought that Israel was just like these other nations and that they could be manipulated if they tapped into the forces of uncleanness. What they failed to recognize or internalize, they had to have seen it, they just didn't internalize it. What they didn't internalize is the Holy One had taken Israel, this particular nation, under his own wing. He was personally supervising this nation. He had not appointed them to be under the powers and principalities that he set in place. So if Israel is under his divine protection, why did the curses activate? He never took away their free will. He didn't take it away in the garden. He didn't take it away in the clouds of glory. And so when they go out in disobedience to commit idolatry at Baal Peor, they walked right into the curse. Because remember, Baal Peor is going to be one of the places where they did their rituals and their sacrifices and where Bilaam wanted to curse them. And so in that case, we know Bilaam couldn't say the words. It was what they did that brought the plague. It wasn't an outside force. It was an inside force. That took them right into the plague. And the example I use with people sometimes to try to explain the word davar. Davar in Hebrew is word. But dever, spelled exactly the same way, is a plague. So on an American coin, the old ones anyway, we had what we called heads and tails. Heads was George Washington and tails was the eagle. And if, let's say that Adam and Eve were given a quarter with heads and tails, and they were told, look, this is a quarter, this is yours, but I only want you to look at heads. I only want you to look at this side of the coin. I don't want you to ever turn the quarter over, because on the other side is disobedience. On the other side is a plague. If you rebel against my word and you experience the other side, you're not going to be able to unexperience what you've seen. And they say, okay, if they only look at the quarter, if they only obey on the head side of the thing, they're going to walk in blessing. But if at any point they turn that quarter over, they've now experienced tails. And And they can't unexperience what they've experienced. So that's kind of the way it is. On the head side, you experience blessing. If you disobey, you've experienced tails, and you will begin to experience the plague. It's the same quarter, the exact same quarter. What makes the difference is obedience or disobedience. And that's what the Israelites found out. They were living in the clouds of glory. They were living in blessing as long as they obeyed. But once they started disobeying, that blessing disappeared, and then the curse had free access to them. We also know that Bilaam wanted to curse Israel from entering the Garden of Eden. He wanted to prevent them from dwelling in the garden that was planted of Adonai. He didn't want them to go back and enjoy those rivers of Eden. And how do we know this? Numbers 24, 2-7. It says, Bilaam raised his eyes and saw Israel camping tribe by tribe, and the Spirit of God came upon him. Then he took up his discourse and said, the declaration of Bilaam, the son of Beor, and the declaration of the man whose eye is opened, the declaration of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down, yet having his eyes uncovered. See, he acknowledges he's in that fallen state, and yet he's being allowed to see into the garden. He's been allowed to see into the clouds of glory, to see Israel. And so he's had his eyes uncovered, and he says, how pleasant are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel, like valleys that stretch out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters. Water will flow from his buckets, and his seed will be by many waters. He's seeing into the Garden of Eden. He's seeing the tents of Jacob within the Garden of Eden. And so he prophesies this, but when he says it, we know he wants the exact opposite. He doesn't want Israel to dwell in the Garden of Eden. He doesn't want them to have the pleasantness of resurrection. He doesn't want them to enjoy the rivers of the Spirit from Genesis 2. That's what you have to do. You just have to look and see how the tongue was twisted. So he's seeing the encampments, but he's seeing them back in their created habitat. And we'll finish up with this one now that the dog has had her fit. He says again in Numbers 23:10, who has counted the dust of Jacob, or the number of the fourth part of Israel? May I die the death of the upright, and may my end be like his. Well, how was his end? Well, there are the tribes, and there are the rivers of Eden. He's saying that's the blessing for these encampments, for these 12 tribes to be restored back into the garden. And he says, may I die this death that they're going to die, because their death is not actually a death. Their death is life. Imagine prophesying this, but not really wanting the opposite. And when he says, who can number the fourth part of Israel? think of how they camped. They camped in 4 divisions, right? So he's referring again back to these 4 divisions of the ox, the eagle, the lion, and the man, representing the 4 spirits, 4 living spirits of Adonai. That divine partnership that Israel was created to have. So he's referring to this. What he's wanting is for the dust of Jacob. He wants the tribes to be weakened. He wants them to be lost among the nations, to lose that identity of that partnership, part of that divine machine, like we said, that actually controls the weather of the earth when it's functioning. He wants to destroy the unity of their camping by those 4 divisions, their degalim, those banners. He wants to dissipate the power of the presence of Adonai that dwelled among them, because as long as they were in unity and obedience, the presence was dwelling among them. He says, no, I would rather that you apostatize, die the death of the wicked, and go to Sheol instead of crossing over the Jordan back into the garden. That's what he truly wants, but he can't help himself from saying, may I die the death of the upright, and may my end be like theirs. They're not going to lose their identity. It may seem like they have, but they won't, because remember that ox of Joseph says he's going to push with his horns all the way to the ends of the earth. But yet he will not be destroyed. He will not be lost. All the dust of Jacob will be collected.